How the turntables. At the start of the war, Ukraine had an inexperienced military and was getting tutored by NATO on how to defeat Russia. Fast forward 4 years, and now it is Ukraine leading the classes. The student has become the teacher, and they even set up a school in Poland just to deliver those lectures. This shift in military prowess, especially as it relates to Ukraine's arms industry, sets up an interesting question. What types of business opportunities does this create for Ukraine? Well, that is the subject of today's edition of the Geopolitics Helpline. Ukraine's defense industry has rapidly developed during the war. The development is driven by sustained battlefield demand and real-time adaptation. For example, drone warfare and countermeasures. That boost to development is contingent on war continuing. Some Ukrainian systems are now attracting interest from foreign buyers like Saudi Arabia and the European Union, potentially creating long-term export opportunities and geopolitical leverage. To what extent can wartime innovation and defense industrial growth create marginal incentives to continue war for states like Ukraine? More broadly, do arms-producing states systematically face incentives to initiate or prolong conflicts due to learning by doing, export potential, or increased military effectiveness? Or are these effects typically negligible compared to the overall costs of war? Splitting the question into its two parts, the incentives for Ukraine at this point run in the opposite direction. Its arms industry is encouraging an end to the war, not because the viewer is wrong in their premises, but because of where we are in the innovation cycle. As for arms production expectations contributing to war more generally, I would describe it as a negligible effect, though there is an interesting signaling incentive that makes the situation more complicated than it seems on the surface. Okay, let's start with what is happening with Ukraine. No doubt that Ukraine has made some significant military innovations over the last 4 years. Drones were barely a part of the conversation at the time of the initial invasion. Now they dominate every discussion that we have. Moreover, the innovations are not stopping. The best theory that we have for why the territorial exchange trends shifted a few months ago is the rise of Ukrainian medium-range drones that effectively duplicate the strike capabilities of Gimler's missiles. Both are key to shutting down logistics, but one costs 3 or 4 times as much. Now, there are a couple of incentives that the new technologies impose on the system. One is that Ukraine is more likely to defeat Russia with them than without. There might be a knee-jerk tendency to conclude that this encourages Ukraine to fight more. That is true in the sense that Ukraine is willing to reject more proposals at the bargaining table than would be the case otherwise. However, by now, I suspect that you know what I'm about to say next. This effect gets washed out by Russia's desire to not demand as much at the bargaining table. We are just shifting expected outcomes. If Ukraine's culture for innovation changes war probabilities for this reason, it must be because of some complicated way that it interacts with the bargaining friction that you think is prolonging the war. I am sure that we could spend a half an hour speculating on how that might work, both positively and negatively, but that is not where this question was focused, so I do not want to get sidetracked. Instead, the viewer wanted to know about how Ukrainian export sales affect crisis bargaining incentives. Well, if we rewind all the way back to January 2022, I would say that they created a very marginal incentive for the war to start. If we thought back then about all of the potential consequences that the war could produce, one of them is what we are currently experiencing. The war lasts long enough, and Ukraine does well enough, that the country eventually becomes a plausible net exporter of weapons. I doubt that anyone in Kyiv would have placed a bet on that back then. But to whatever degree there was some slight chance in their minds that this could happen, then it created some benefit to fighting the war. This was not nearly enough, of course, to erase the rest of Ukraine's costs. Nonetheless, slightly lower costs lead to slightly more wars for most bargaining frictions, so I suppose that this had some marginal effect. Again, marginal because the benefit pales in comparison to everything else that Ukraine has lost over the last 4+ years. Meanwhile, what is happening currently with these incentives is much more interesting, because the situation has flipped. the war continuing now hurts Ukraine on the arms manufacturing front. I know that sounds weird, but let me explain. At this point, everyone is aware of what Ukraine has been up to. This is not particularly new information either, despite broader attention being paid with the Iran war. The reason, for example, that Saudi Arabia did not invest in Ukrainian equipment earlier was political. It did not want to run afoul of the Kremlin. The United States also made a wager that its exquisite systems were better than trying to operate multiple types of systems, a hypothesis that the Pentagon will now be revisiting. But the bottom line is that there are drones everywhere, that countries will want to purchase. There are your basic short-range quadcopters that dominate the line of contact. There are medium-range drones that are the current talk of the town, which take out enemy logistics. There are long-range drones that have crushed Russia's oil infrastructure. There are drones that will take out all of those other drones. Plus you have some pink birds flying around, which are missiles, not drones, even though that detail is easy to get lost in the shuffle. All of these are significantly cheaper than comparable Western systems on the market, albeit with some trade-offs. I think that the middle-range drones are the most interesting here, and not just because they are the cool new thing. NATO's game plan has always been to use air power to destroy the enemy's supply lines, which would then allow its ground forces to do mop-up work. The first half of that strategy traditionally relies on expensive aircraft. If, and this is a big if, Ukraine can demonstrate that similar effects are possible with mid-range drones, you will have a whole lot of interested buyers. Note that I think that a lot of observers are getting ahead of themselves, hoping that these numbers reflect an inevitable march to the Sea of Azov. June's numbers have been slower than what we have seen recently, though this specific point is irrelevant for today's main claim. Indeed, at this point, you might be getting a bit confused. The claim that I started with was that the continued conflict now hurts Ukraine's arms export industry. But I just spent the last minute talking about all of the great innovations that Ukraine has made over the last 4 years. Won't Ukraine make further innovations if the war continues? Yeah, probably. But if the war freezes right now, the counter-coalition will not be rapidly innovating anymore either. And I think that we are at the point where Ukraine has done enough field research that it is time to move the metaphorical company from a growth stock to a cash cow. The problem with making that switch is, Ukraine is still in the middle of a war. When Russia is not striking the middle of Kyiv, Ukrainian factories are also in the Russian crosshairs. Ukraine speaks of having the capacity to expand its factories if given international investment. But either way, the core of its production will still end up exploding somewhere in or over Russian-held territory. However, the moment that the war stops is the moment that Ukraine will welcome all customers near and far. It might very well form one of Ukraine's chief export industries for a few years, at least until other militaries catch up. Okay, that takes care of Ukraine's situation. But the original question also asked about the general theoretical incentives of a more systemic need to prove oneself. This is different from Ukraine's evolution, where the country had no real expertise at the beginning of the war, and instead developed it over time out of necessity. Nonetheless, I think that the earlier discussion about Ukraine's pre-war incentives covers the main point. I am sure that this incentive exists out in the wild, but I have doubts whether it is a primary motivator for any conflict. That said, here is some speculative theory about what could be true someday in the future. Again, I'm offering no empirical claims about it right now, but sometimes these exercises are useful. You may, for example, recall that I had worked out a model where you could get something like the Obama-era Iran deal to work about a couple of years before it happened. Anyway, let's say that you have a country that is extremely confident about the quality of its military hardware. However, no one wants to buy it because the common consensus is that it is bad. Then you have the viewer's first-order incentive to start a war to showcase its capabilities. But you still have all the other costs that act as a countervailing force, so it might not be clear that this actually should result in a war. Here is where things get interesting. Everyone has a common consensus that the country has bad hardware, including the primary opponent. Well, that would also manifest itself in crisis bargaining as uncertainty over the expected outcome. And that, we know, is a great explanation for war. Plus, we have the double whammy with the windfall coming from future arms sales, which makes war look less costly. So the need to signal the country's military prowess carries through to the proximate military crisis, both causing the war and proving the country's military utility to others. Meanwhile, if I just prove the utility of the Geopolitics Helpline to you, then why not continue watching its archive? You know, I am not superstitious, but I am a little stitious. Hence these videos tend to end in a similar fashion. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you tomorrow. Take care.